for renaturing cities and improving cities. Are we ready for the next presentation? So now, let's welcome Melissa STERRY. She works a lot with the greatest engineer that we have on this planet, and that is nature. She's going to talk about bio-innovation. So please give a warm welcome to Melissa STERRY.
Good morning. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today in this beautiful city, and I think the most sublime venue that I've ever spoken at, with a waterfall, butterflies, dragonflies. I doff my hat to whoever chose this. So today, we're going to dive into the natural world, and we're going to be looking at how we can take Santa Cruz forward in synergy with the biology, with the wildlife that is local to this place. But before we do that, I'm going to contextualize the wider context in which we're working. Now, this might be part of islands in the middle of the ocean, but it is deeply connected to the history of ecology and of evolution. The man on the screen, I'm sure you will all know his name because he's so affiliated with this island, Alexander von Humboldt. He is credited within the scientific domain as being the father of ecology, the first person to actually join the dots and realize the relations between species. He's also the father of environmentalism. He's the first person on record to look at things that we were doing, humans were doing, and to realize, to look into the future and understand that this was going to cause problems. He was hugely inspired by his visit to Tenerife. On the screen, I'll read out the quote. In considering the study of physical phenomena, not merely in its bearing on the material wants of life, but in its general influence of the intellectual advancement of mankind, we can find its noblest and most important result to be a knowledge of the chain of connection. Now, he came here on a visit to South America. It was actually the Spanish that can claim to be the catalyst for that, because he'd actually been trying to get to South America for quite a while. And it was basically the Spanish royal family that got behind him and said, we will get you to South America. And it was in that period that he made many of the fundamental breakthroughs that took us into the modern age of biological sciences. He inspired many individuals because of his works, which here we've got. He was one of the first people to actually look and realize that there were bioclimates. He understood the fact that plants weren't just generic in how they evolved in their form, in their functions, but they were specific to place. And so he studied multiple systems to do this. He looked at the climate, he looked at the weather, he looked at the ecology, he looked at the animals, the plants, the everything. And he mapped out this really important aspect of science. And he hugely inspired Charles Darwin. But for Alexander von Humboldt, Darwin's work might never have taken him to the point of writing the origin of species. But unfortunately, and I feel I've made quite an achievement in getting here, Darwin never got onto the island. He came to Tenerife wanting to do ecological studies here, but due to a plague outbreak, he was quarantined on the ship for 12 days, and he lamented about it. He was sad about it all his life. So I got here when Darwin didn't. But we're now going to jump forward. We have been taking inspiration from the natural world since we first took step. The idea that nature-inspired design is new Not true. Humans have been looking around them, getting a light bulb moment, a genius idea, having observed an animal or a plant for longer than we're ever going to be able to record, for longer than we have artifacts to clarify. But within relative recent history, which in my work, I look back over hundreds of millions of years. So when I think about recent history, we're talking about the last 10,000 years. In relative recent history, we've had a couple of individuals that have really taken this nature-inspired design forward. So one of the most famous is the man who actually inspired my entry into this domain, Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci, when I was young, was known as an artist. Everybody knew The Last Supper, everybody knew the Mona Lisa. But the greater body of his work was not his art. That was just one of the things he did. Most of the art he created was to monetize his scientific studies. It was to get the patronage, it was to get the cash flow to do his scientific work. He was always an outsider. He was an illegitimate child. He didn't grow up within the conventional structure of society. He could not go and study at certain institutions because he was seen to be too lowly. He was not regarded as being appropriate. So he taught himself. He went out into the countryside, and from a young child, he was looking around at the natural world, making observations. Yes, he went into the studio of Verrocchio, and he perfected the art of drawing and sculpture, so much so that his mentor, his master Verrocchio, actually decided to basically give up. He saw Leonardo and he thought, I'm never going to get as good as my protege. We don't know how many things that Leonardo da Vinci invented that were nature-inspired during his lifetime. There are estimates it could have been 22,000. 22,000 possible ideas. Now, when I say inventions, there's a lot of mystery around Leonardo da Vinci because many of the people at that time that were also looking to nature and were creating things were not really recorded. So we don't have a really clear idea, but we do know from the gathered works, which are put into what are called codexes. Now, they weren't made by Leonardo da Vinci. When he died, those in his studio put them together and they compiled them into, there is the Leicester Codex, which is, many of these works were bought by very rich people. And this was always happening. The Spanish aristocracy have one, the royal family in Britain have one. So these works are around the world. I've had the great privilege of actually seeing a number of these works firsthand and of actually looking at Leonardo da Vinci's work. And it is quite extraordinary, the detail that he was looking into the flow of water, looking into the way that the air moved, looking at the way that bats, birds, butterflies flew, understanding this in a mechanical way. Leonardo da Vinci was approximately 500 years ahead of many of the fields that we today rely on within our industries. He didn't just think up flying machines. He actually thought up many of them, including a concept for what would become the helicopter and for gliders. He created military devices. Now, this is one of the things about Leonardo da Vinci that I really relate to. He was always struggling to get funding for his research. So he had lots of side hustles. The paintings were a bit of a side hustle. And if you look to his paintings, you notice he only ever bothered to finish a commission if it had an innovation in it. He didn't paint for its own right. There had to be something new, a contribution to the field. He also became an event manager. Well, basically, he became the head of entertainment to the Duke of Milan for a while. Now, in that process, as it turned out, when he was thinking about how to entertain the wealthy of Milan, he actually made his first step into what would become robotics. He's credited as actually creating one of the first robotic devices. And there's a picture here. That's me with an academic who specializes in Da Vinci with a lion that he created, where he was basically thinking about automation and how you would create different devices that could be useful in various ways. So he became an entertainment manager, various other things, but he essentially, his whole life, until he died at the patronage of Francis I, the King of France, he was thinking up new ideas from the natural world. One of the areas, interestingly, where he didn't actually really apply his inspiration to the natural world was architecture. The man that has the credit for that is Spanish. It's Gaudi. Many people look at Gaudi's work and they think it's rather exotic. It's very interesting because aesthetically it is so different to the majority of buildings today. If you look at modernism, the buildings of the 20th century, most of them are boxes with holes in, with windows. They're not very structurally sophisticated. There is a reason for that, and it actually links into the very site that we've been talking about developing, the oil refinery. But I'll get to that later. Gaudi was looking at the process of materiality within nature, and this is how his great ideas came into being. He didn't just sort of come up with an aesthetics, the way something looked. He wasn't particularly driven by the beauty of his buildings. He wanted to understand their workings, and so this is where the genius of Gaudi comes in. Now, Gaudi is not somebody that you often see referred to by, let's say, many people that are talking about biomimicry, which is the sort of the relatively new term for nature-inspired thinking and design. But he was thinking about all of the things that are absolutely fundamental to nature-inspired design back in his lifetime in the 19th century. So going on, so I keep clicking that way, and it's this way I've got to click. And of course, Gaudi's work is today iconic, and in of itself, these incredible buildings attract people to come and see them. They are an attractor, they're a magnet for the city of Barcelona. They're one of the primary reasons that many tourists will go there. They are intimately connected with its identity. But their origin, as I said, it was the natural world. This is where the forms, this is where the processes, this is where the engineering came from. I was inspired by nature-inspired design before we had all of the names we had today. So as a child in the 1980s, I was going out, looking to nature, trying to understand it. When I went to design school, which was in 1993, there were no courses. There was nowhere you could really go to study this sort of domain of design. And so when I was in my second year, like another student at that time, I was doing experiments in my bedroom while I was in college, because that was my laboratory. The year before I actually created my first project in what we would today call regenerative design, this designer, who is today one of the world's top designers, Hussein Chalayan, he created a collection where he took fabrics and he buried them in the ground. He just dug a hole, stuck the fabrics in, and then left it for a while. And then later he just went back and dug it up. He dug the fabrics up. And he had thought about the process. He'd embedded some, basically, some metals that would oxidize. And he was interested in the patination of the fabric. And if that, his collection, that's his student, his graduate collection, if that looks a bit like soil and very organic, well, it's because it spent a period of time in the ground. The following year, I created one of my collections. This was my first collection. We didn't really have the term cradle to cradle then. This was not a thing. But what I was looking at was not so much the patination, the aesthetics. What I wanted to do, my dream, was to solve the problem of throwaway fashion, of the fact that we were already getting mountains of clothes because we'd entered the age when cheap manufacture had meant that people didn't value their clothes as they used to do. So they didn't even keep them for a period of, let's say, months or years, let alone hand them down through the generations. So I wanted to create clothes that you could literally wear for one season, one, let's say, 3-month period, and throw it on your compost heap. Throw it with the vegetables, and it would biodegrade, and it would become a nutrient, and it would be completely reabsorbed into the environment. But I realized that this was going to be a challenge, because this was the day and age when we had the supermodels and Versace and gold, and it was all about ostentatiousness. So a measure of, well, I started looking not just at the cycling of the materials, but at the kind of geological processes that could inspire them, the formations of rocks, these kind of things. How do rocks form? What are the processes? Ecology. And I realized that it was the materiality that was the big challenge. But when I finished that project, which was in 1995, I wanted to try and get funding to expand this. And I found there was none. I could get nowhere, no grants, no absolutely nothing. I couldn't even get a work placement that would take me on. So my naive little 20-something self thought, I'll set up my own business, which I ran for 18 months. I could do the design, the making, the marketing. I knew nothing about finance. I knew nothing about the technical side. And so after 18 months, I realized I've got to give my business up. It's not going to work. And I went into the traditional fashion industry, and I saw just how bad that industry was. And it still remains one of the worst industries in the world in terms of waste, in terms of pollution, and many, many other things. But this is the sort of early origins for my journey. If we leap forward a bit, there have been a lot of designers that have been looking at how we can mimic nature materially, particularly in architecture, in furniture design, and what you're looking at here are material experiments. So, for example, the chair, you might not be able to see it, but down here, this here is a chair. And this chair was not designed by a designer that sort of stood at a drawing board and just dumped what was in their mind onto the canvas. This chair was created by working out a code, codifying the process by which plants create their form. So it has what we would think of as a genetic form. The designer did not know, and he actually made a program, a computer software program, that can churn out chairs in different forms for different climates, different environments. Here we have another material experiment which is working with biochemistry. And this involved the designer basically throwing a bunch of chemicals into a vat, into a tank, then throwing some frames, sort of like an architectural wire frame, and then leaving the structure in the vat with all the chemicals, and then through a process again, mimicking natural systems, a material form occurs. This has so far been scaled from furniture to a room. So a whole room of which the entire interior has been formed. What they did is they sealed the room like a great big tank, pulled in the liquid and the chemicals, left it for a while, and then released out the chemicals, and they saw what was left. So a very different kind of process. And then we have another very popular form of biomateriality. It involves basically creating, again, usually a tank, putting in some ingredients, a little bit like making a cake, and then letting it go through a process. And so the material forms. So this is the big sort of frontier that has been pushing out really the last 15 years. This has all gained traction. I do a lot of work over the years with university students, with masters, with PhDs and what have you. And these are images from actually some work at the Bartlett University College in London. And when I go to a crit or I'm involved in engaging with the students, it's more like a science lab, because there will be tables and tables with experiments going on, sometimes involving creatures, sometimes they're working with tarantulas, spiders, ants, various different organisms. And those organisms are involved in the design process. So, for example, they will look at essentially the tensile properties, the engineering qualities of a spider's web. And then they will look at how they could apply that to a building. Or they will look at how termites or ants form their mound, or how that's formed. And they'll do that for looking at the airflow, for creating air conditioning purely through the material form, because termites and ants are among the best in the insect world at doing that. And it's like a zoo. It's like going not so much into a studio, but a zoo. There's all these creatures. And that area of material research, I would say in science we have an expression called the point of saturation. And this is the point at which if you repeat the experiment, you just get the same results. So there's no point in doing it again. And there are many, many experiments that have been going on with other organisms, with plants, with fungi, with bacteria, with animals, where we have already reached the point of saturation. So we know what we're working with. Here are some more ways in which over the past 15 years, a number of architects and designers have been working with other organisms or looking at natural processes. So some good friends of mine are called Ecologic Studio. They're Italian, they're a husband and wife couple, and they have been largely working with algae to create architectural systems. You will see a couple of examples in a moment. And they are looking at how you integrate these living organisms into the architecture to address things like creating carbon offsetting. So you are basically you're turning the building into a plant to all intents and purposes. Looking at creating food production. So you're simultaneously reducing your carbon emissions while producing food, among other things. Then we have at MIT in Boston, they have one of the historic projects before Neri Oxman left, was they looked at whether you could take organisms like silkworms and you could put them in a room with a structure, metal frame, and they would create your fabrication for you. So in this case, this was a frame, and then it was left in basically a laboratory. They put the silkworms in there, they fed them, and they created the materiality. Now, obviously, silk is fairly strong as a fiber, but obviously this has very specific uses, very specific applications. It's not going to be, for example, suitable to put outdoors, but you could use this application indoors. And there are various other ways. This structure here, this piece, basically is responsive to the environment, so it shape-shifts, it changes form depending on where the wind is, depending on the weather conditions. And these are a couple of the classes of architecture that have really developed the last 15 years. And just actually finally down here, this was a concept piece, but the form of that building actually shape-shifts in response to wind conditions, not necessarily to harvest energy, but to make the building more able to take a high wind to basically retain its form during a hurricane, cyclone, that kind of event. So can a building shape-shift, and so it has less exposure to the risk from those kind of events. This is one of the most exciting fields of exploration. And it involves working with living organisms, most of them marine species, to create light. And what have we got here? He's sadly passed away, but in the United Kingdom, there was a wonderful professor called Simon Park. And he did lots of incredible experiments from the small to the big scale, where he was taking a species that's actually quite common in the world's oceans. If you've ever seen the pictures of waves coming in, and then they light up with a blue light, Dinoflagellate, and he took this species, and he, among other things, his most ambitious project was creating an alien communication device, basically something to communicate with aliens off in interstellar space by creating a massive area of these organisms in the ocean and manipulating their light emission. Okay, so this organism, this is why they glow up when waves are crashing. They respond to movement. It's a defense within the ecological world. They light up because it scares their predators. So he took that property to create what he hoped would be something that could communicate with extraterrestrial life. That's sort of the biggest scale that we can get here. But there are much more modest applications. So here we've got a little light, a child's light. It takes exactly the same species, puts it in a device, and this light, you feed the species, and the child who's got this, it was inspired by a dinosaur. The child can have it on their bedside table, and if at night they want some light, they shake the device, and it lights up. So it is both, fun and practical. Now, this area of exploration, some areas are novel. They could be just for fun, and others are more serious. But this is part of what we might think of the next generation of energy. So you'll all be familiar with solar, with wind, with hydropower, hydro dams, and so forth. But actually, many of the most pioneering minds in energy are not looking at these big-scale operations. They're looking at two things. They're looking at how do we create energy at a local, distributed scale, using organisms, and that's what we have here. This is a chandelier that glows, that emits light through bacteria. The bacteria, in this case, is the organism that responds to a stimulator and glow. So again, this whole sort of theme in this is like, think of your energy system like a pet or like livestock. You treat it in the same way. It has to be cared for. You have to give it nutrients, but it doesn't have some of the same problems of conventional energy. The other big shift here, and again, I will show you an example shortly, is devices that are much better designed. And this is where I'm getting back. Do you remember I mentioned architecture and that we've all found ourselves living in boxes with holes? Now, if you think back to the old architectures, think back to the 1800s, think back to the age before we relied on oil. The buildings looked different. The buildings worked. The buildings didn't just sit there inertly, relying on external power to heat them, to cool them. They had passive systems, and these are found all over the world. Systems that involve architecture harvesting water, rainwater harvesting. This is a standard in those regions of the world that are arid. Architecture that passively cools, that can deflect the heat of the external environment, so you don't need air conditioning. You don't need an external power source. And all the kind of external factors that can make being in a building uncomfortable, our ancestors and all over the world had already solved. But what happened when cheap fuel came in is we shifted. Because less money and less time and less thought was put into architecture that worked hard, and instead, cheap, fast architecture was created, off the shelf. And you'll notice that that style of architecture became generic around the world. And that is because oil flowed around the world, and it still does. We can see the impact right now. Europe apparently has 4 to 6 weeks of jet fuel left because a lot of it is stuck in the Strait of Hormuz. We still rely on the flow of fossil fuels, but we didn't always. And this has a profound, these external factors have a profound impact on what we design and all of the infrastructure around it. So thinking about the other thing that has become a major, major shift in design, it is efficiency. I have a good friend and a peer of mine called Professor Rachel Armstrong. She is the pioneer, essentially, of living architecture. She will create buildings, but only if they integrate organisms. One of her big projects was for Venice, looking at how we can stop Venice from sinking by bringing in, basically, marine organisms that can help to support the foundations, so setting that process in motion. But her current project, which I think has got some European funding, is trying to create an energy vat for a house, which is basically with microorganisms, but simultaneous to that, looking at how we reduce the energy consumption of devices. We already see this trend in the marketplace with things like energy-efficient fridges. If you go to buy a fridge, kettle, this kind of thing, now you get an energy indicator. How good is it at working? But the shift towards much more energy-efficient design is the big, big trend that we are now facing. So where are we right now? Where are we right now? So this is a company I work very closely with. They grow chairs in an orchard. They have an acre of land. Just think of it like a chunk of this parliamentarium. And they have trees all planted that they then, through horticultural processes, curate into the final object. Like this one, this chair, as I said, was grown. Now, it has a structural advantage. Because it doesn't have joints, it's pretty indestructible. You can chuck this thing around. It's not going to break because, as I said, it has huge capacity in terms of wear. Now, yes, like Gaudi's buildings, it looks quite exotic compared to conventional chairs because you can't, obviously, with the tree, you can't give it a specific design blueprint to work to. The tree is going to make a few creative decisions. But you might be thinking, well, I mean, how many people are going to want this chair? How popular is this going to be? It's all a bit, I always say, Jesus sandals. You know, do you remember when environmentalism, the strappy sandals, and it all used to be a little bit sort of homemade. And some people might look at it and say that, and I know that, because one of the reasons I've been helping this company is because they found that it was an absolute nightmare trying to make it commercially successful. They'd been there, their original business plan was that they'd plant lots and lots of these trees to become chairs, and then they'd sell them at £500 each. And then they realized, hang on a minute, it takes 7 years to grow a chair, and we don't get all the harvest. As with farming more generally, some of the chairs are lost because maybe they get heat stress or they die off because of the cold. So I helped them to reinvent their business model. I said, what we have here is a seminal design concept, and we need to be selling these to very wealthy people, basically. And today, these chairs are now at MoMA in New York. They're at the National Museum of Scotland. They're in a collection in Holland. They're basically everywhere. And one of the biggest fans is the heir to the Louis Vuitton dynasty, in effect. And Louis Vuitton have shown the chairs and some of the objects being grown in the chair orchard in their storefronts around the world. They've won awards for it, and this has put it slap bang in the heart of the luxury marketplace. What is the value of these chairs now? So remember I said to you it was £500 was their benchmark. Well, a little number is coming out this May, this coming month, that is valued at £1 million. So that is the transition. So I mentioned Ecologic Studio. This is Claudia Pasquero and Marco Paletto, pair of brilliant Italians, and this is one of their architectural installations. Again, it looks very organic, it looks very different to your kind of classic architectural interior. But in here, we have a system that can integrate to multiple kinds of buildings and simultaneously serve as a food source, a local food source, a highly nutritious one, and help offset carbon. And because, in particular, Claudia is a brilliant designer, and she understands that for something to take off, it needs to be appealing. It needs to look good. People don't just want to have something because it's going to save the planet. They want something that is desirable. And so here she thought through the devices that these are glasses that you actually attach the pipe, growing the spirula. It's a really nutritious form of algae. You pour it into these beautiful devices. And so it gets it into things like Wallpaper magazine, Vogue magazine, Interiors magazine. And that starts to make people think it is desirable. This concept here is actually a graduate project by a friend of mine, Rachel Horton-Kitchlew. And her project, she decided, how can I make growing food at home appealing to people that are sort of not really horticultural? So she found some species that are very difficult to kill. Even if you kill all your plants, you won't kill this one. And she designed this device to pop it into in order to look attractive. And in terms of placemaking, Gardens by the Bay by Grant Associates in Singapore is probably one of the most successful examples. Very similar to this, an area that was basically wasteland, handed over to become a botanical park. I've got an interview that I did with Andrew, it's his firm that designed these. And they said, Singapore wasn't really too sure how big an attractor this would be in the first instance. But within a couple of years, they'd had 82 million visitors, and this has become regarded as like one of the new wonders of the world. And I was talking about energy efficiency. This here is a concept that I came across in the noughties, created by innovators in California that decided to create an energy-efficient vehicle, but not to try and improve on what we've got, but to start from scratch. So they brought in aeronautics engineers. They look to nature, and this is actually partly inspired by, when you see birds that dive into the ocean, and they bring their wings in to protect them, but also it's to accelerate the thrust into the ocean to fish. It was inspired by that. And this does 1,000 kilometers on a single charge. It has 3 wheels, not 4, because it reduces the friction on the road. The aerodynamic form cuts out energy use. It uses yet less form because it cuts through the air like an aeroplane or a spaceship. And they worked with engineers to create a new structural material for the vehicle because they worked out conventional car materiality was too heavy. Today, they have managed, after all of that time, to get this to the point where they're going to be opening their factories and selling them. You can put an order for one of these in right now. And, brilliant, I love this, you can charge it conventionally at an EV charging point, or you don't have to put any energy into it because it's got an integrated solar panel and it will charge itself. So imagine that, never having to buy any fuel. So how do we integrate this and think about the future of Santa Cruz? So I was looking at your ecology. I was thinking, gosh, they've got all these plants. What should we go for? So I went for an obvious one. I went for your natural symbol. And I thought, what might we do with that? Or what would Gaudi do? What would Gaudi do if he was still with us today? What might we learn from that particular tree, which I'm sure there'll be some species, a couple of specimens in this center. So how would we design some buildings for Santa Cruz if we were learning from one of your native plants? What have we got here? Well, we've got an integrated rainwater harvesting system because these roofs are large, so there's a large surface water, partly to collect a lot of rain, which can then channel down, just like in the branches, channel down. And so you're collecting, I believe you had 19 storms this year, and you normally have 2 or 3. So that rain becomes a resource. What else have we got? We've got natural shading. Many of your buildings here, because they're boxes with windows, there's no natural shading. So we create shading. Maybe have a covered walkway, just like in a forest. Think of the architecture like a forest. What else might we have? Materially, what is it going to be made of? It can be made of many, many things. We could grow the materials, or we could use some of your traditional materials. We could use maybe some stucco. We'll just see what's around. This would be an R&D project. Work it out. The road here, there are now sponge surfaces that for pavements and for roads actually absorb the water when it comes, so you don't get flash flooding, and then you can store it. So it will take it away, removing the problem of flooding, I put a little Aptera in because I thought that would be a perfect vehicle to be driving around Santa Cruz. No need for a fuel station. Everybody just has a solar-powered car. So this was just a provisional play around where I was kind of looking, and I am using AI here, I should say that, to help me. So in the sunshine, it helps protect shading, reduces the need for air conditioning, and I've heard about your weather. When it's raining, it collects the water. Architecturally, thinking again about Barcelona, what might the next generation of Santa Cruz's architecture be? I've already had a look around. You've got some beautiful buildings here. I noticed particularly sort of Art Deco, mid-20th century, but really stunning buildings. What's the next gen going to look like? Is Santa Cruz going to become an architectural wonder of the world? Could the oil refinery have some features on it that attract people and that, like Gardens of the Bay, get people talking far and wide? And might Santa Cruz work with its local researchers? Might it actually create its own experiments in biodesign? Might it actually create its own biomaterials? Might you have little businesses, but also bring in the local community and make this integrated? So as Jenny was saying in her presentation, you're not creating division. You're making sure that everybody is involved in the process. What might your Gardens of the Bay look like? I saw you have, just immediately around us, some iconic architecture, but might it be that you create something like this, an innovation center, where you can not just host your own island and from across all the Canaries talent, but you bring in more. I saw you've got Starmus, which is for the musicians and for the astronomers. And it's meant to be the #1 astronomical event in the world. I definitely want to go there. But might you become the #1 place for nature-inspired design? After all, this is where von Humboldt came, and this is where he basically catalyzed what became the origin of species through inspiring Charles Darwin. Might this be, currently there is no global fashion week for biodesign. There isn't one. Biodesign fashion is quite a small area. You could name the top designers on about 2 hands, but there are lots and lots of up-and-coming designers. Might Santa Cruz become the #1 place? Might we attract everyone who is anyone in this domain to Santa Cruz? And this draws on your connections. As I said, you might be an island, but you have intimate connections with the rest of the world with a very strong ecological point. So inside, we could have all kinds of experiments looking not just at your terrestrial ecology, but your marine ecology. Bananas, what could we do with bananas? I found that that's your #1 agricultural crop. Well, with bananas in the Philippines, they're taking the husk of a banana trunk, and what they're doing with it is they're taking the fibers and they've turned this into a luxury material that is now being used by the likes of Balenciaga, top fashion houses, to make accessories, to make garments. And with this fiber, the banana fiber, from what would have been waste, they're making jersey, they're making soft fabrics, they are making woven fabrics, all your fabric needs for a fashion house. And if you were going to make the fabric on the island, well then why not bring in some fashion designers? Why not support fashion designers and do partnerships? And this is what is going on in the Philippines. And what it has meant is that these small islands are now connected with designers and producers all over the world. So more than a tasty fruit. And just lastly, and I will wrap on this, my particular specialism is looking at natural hazards. I started with eruptions, went on to the biggest scale of natural hazard I could think of, which was an asteroid impact. And then I specialized in plants, how do plants respond, and more particularly wildfires. So in my thesis, I had anticipated, this is a sketch of the devastation in Los Angeles in 2025. I'd already seen that in my research, that we would see this kind of destruction. But getting ahead of it, where do we look? I looked at the fire record. Fire's been on Earth since the Silurian, 420 million years ago, and the plants of the world have co-evolved with fire. More particularly, I know I've got to say it looks like a fossilized turd. Apologies, but what this actually is, this is a fossilized pine cone. This is coal, it's anthracite. And I've studied the evolution of plants with fire and looked at the ancestors from these millions of years ago. And I'm particularly obsessed with bark, which is the most incredible material that can resist fire. Now, you here on the islands have a particular pine that I believe is extremely good at regenerating in the advent of fire, and at pine cones. I look at them from the micro level up to the systems level, so field research and lab research, integrating our leading systems science really from the field has been in development for a long time, but really the last 100 years, created what I think to be the architecture that should be used for planning. In California, these are the four factors that are considered when writing the building codes for buildings. We've got economics, firefighting capacity, some aspects of the physics of fire, and the philosophy, the lens. This is why every presidential change, all the fire codes get affected. And this is what I think we should have. So what is this? This is integrating indigenous communities and their knowledge, all of these things, but also what do we have at the state of the biotechnology? What do we have in terms of space systems science? We can understand a lot about the environment from space. We can even monitor the state of forests from space. Integrating the satellite technologies, the systems view, and, well, there's the list right there. So a much more complicated aim. I've written into building codes. That's something I completed 2017. Wrote all the literature and worked out, okay, philosophically, conceptually, how do we integrate this? But then this gets to the exciting bit. What can we invent? So looking at pine cones, looking at the properties and inventing new systems, new products, and then working out how we would actually integrate these. Now, in an ideal world, I might do a Gaudi, and I might create an entirely new architectural system that looks totally organic. But the reality is that most of the buildings that will be here in 20 or 30 years' time are already built. So then, looking at how do we take the workings of nature and apply them to a building. What is this? This is my biobark. I visualize this because I've worked out that the physics and the biochemistry of bark of certain plants is resistant to wildfires. So this is a form of cladding. And the question is, how do we take something exotic and how do we make it palatable? How do we make it appeal to the public? So the whole Earth systems approach. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of dedication, and most of the people working in this are fairly under-supported. And you can find quite a few of them. I think it's now 26 interviews with my peers across the leading areas of these sciences. You'll find them on the Substack, completely open access, and, well, you'll see some of the latest interviews, but basically I've made this open access. And just lastly, I'm going to share with you, this is the interest level we have. So in 2013, I accidentally opened a magazine. I'd been bookmarking the features of the works around the world that I thought were quite interesting in biomaterials and biodesign. And then a colleague said to me, oh, I'd really love to have a look. I said, okay, I'll put it on open access. Within a year, there had been 3 million shares globally of the content, and I had over 160,000 followers. And that is off the back of a little publication that I just put together with no budget and just updated once a week when I had a little bit of time. So that was 2013. So I think that the future for Santa Cruz could be extraordinary. I think you have the cultural heritage, you have the ecological source material, and I'll let you imagine what might be. Thank you.